Hey everyone, welcome to another episode. Today we'll be discussing Season 2, Episode 5 of his Dark Materials, The Scholar. I so enjoyed this episode. I had such a fantastic time watching it after a very long day. I can only describe my favorite scenes in this episode as fan fiction, though definitely the best kind. I think the show is really veering far from the original source material in this season, and to be honest, I am totally here for it. I think some of the most interesting, most intelligent scenes are the ones that are completely fabricated, and I've got to say that Ruth Wilson, she knows what I want to see, even when I don't know what I want to see. So yeah, let's talk about this crazy episode. This episode started with the Golden Monkey Demon and Mrs. Coulter, his human, strapped into Lord Boreal's car, ostensibly waiting for him. I really loved this small moment. We see that Mrs. Coulter is focusing her gaze on a woman who has a baby in a stroller and is simultaneously on a laptop. I think that really set the tone for the episode, believe it or not. I think, for me at least, this episode was all about Mrs. Coulter confronting her existence, confronting her own conceptions of motherhood, her own personal limitations, and the limitations that society has foisted upon her. So I thought this was a really clever way to give us a sneak preview of all of those internal things happening with her. When Lord Boreal finally arrives with the coffee and hands it over, he can see that Mrs. Coulter is observing this new yet very familiar world, and he has some thoughts about the culture here. He says, "No demons. Seems barbaric, doesn't it? They have the appearance of freedom, but the government's far more corrupt than the Magisterium. Twice as many shopping arcades, half as many places of worship. It's a culture of consumerism, not faith. Prepare yourself, Marisa." I loved this commentary from Boreal because he is part of that Magisterium corruption. These two are people who supposedly support the structure of faith and morality and are definitely two of the least moral people that we've seen so far. In Chitagatse, Will is really struggling with the idea that he may not really be able to use the knife when he needs to. The kids are devising their plan to get the alethiometer back and are definitely bent on stealing it rather than handing over the knife. They have decided to draw a map of Lord Boreal's house to figure out where exactly they should best position themselves, and Will is really not so confident in his skills. Lyra does not have that doubt. She firmly believes in him. Lord Boreal takes Mrs. Coulter to his house. He's so proud of this big shiny mansion that he has purchased and outfitted with the newest technology, and he takes her to his collection room to show her all of the trinkets that he has acquired and all of the important historical pieces, and she does not give a fuck. He tries to show her a piece of the Berlin Wall. She doesn't care. He puts on some sweet tunes for her over his surround sound system. She really doesn't care. And I just loved the relatability of this. I feel like Lord Boreal is all of those dudes and some ladies who are really into their things, thinks that they can impress their potential partner with them. And not everyone is into materialism, guys. Just gonna put that out there. I also really loved these scenes in Boreal's collection room with Mrs. Coulter because she looks so uncomfortable. She just was so unmoved by Lord Boreal's peacocking to her. It was, thank you, Ruth Wilson, for giving me this joy. When Lord Boreal realizes that he can't really seduce Mrs. Coulter with his technology, he takes a different tactic and tells Mrs. Coulter about meeting Dr. Mary Malone and the fact that he knows that she interacted with Lyra and learned about dust from Dr. Malone. Mrs. Coulter immediately perks up and wants to know everything about this, under the premise that because she is Lyra's mother, she needs to know what kind of nonsense other people might be filling Lyra's brain with. When Mrs. Coulter hears that Dr. Malone is the head of this research unit, she's definitely confused. She asks Lord Boreal about this, and he says, "Science in this world is different," And this is when Mrs. Coulter's wheels start turning. She realizes that women have more potential here. The glass ceiling holding women down is quite a bit higher in this world than it is in hers, and this is really the beginning of Mrs. Coulter's existential meltdown. She decides she wants to meet Dr. Malone immediately, and Lord Boreal eventually agrees to that, but says, "You're way too conspicuous in this getup. We need to get you looking more like the locals." Cue my favorite scene of this series. Luckily for her, perhaps, Lord Boreal has been thoughtful and considerate enough to buy Mrs. Coulter some clothes that he thinks that she might like and are somehow miraculously in her size. She picks up a pair of jeans in absolute revulsion. She dismisses this idea and then lands on a very sensible, beautiful pair of black slacks. Lord Boreal, meanwhile, has been hovering like the creep that he is, hoping to watch her undress, and she tells him to get out. She is not about that. She picks up the outfit she has decided on and is holding it in front of the mirror and looks at her hair, and I really liked this moment. She flattens this very stiff, very coiffed hairdo that she has, and I think in that moment realizes that she doesn't need to be this person anymore. I just thought this was so well executed acting wise. And I love also that the golden monkey demon is looking at himself in the mirror as well. I think there is something to that, some symbolism that we will talk about shortly. Back in Lyra's world, we head back to Father MacPhail, who is currently leading a meeting of the Magisterium higher-ups. There is some concern that with the anomaly that Azrael has created, there is defection, and people are starting to lose their faith in the Magisterium, maybe in the authority, we don't know. There is some concern in the higher-ups of the Magisterium that they haven't actually spotted Mrs. Coulter since Father MacPhail's rise to cardinalship. They know that she has a relationship with Lord Azrael, and they're worried that she might be doing something illicit. This really sparks a negative response in Father MacPhail, and he decides to clamp down. Father Graves insists that the Magisterium put out a formal and public denial of the anomaly. He thinks that will solve their problems, but Father MacPhail is not at all convinced. There's definitely a power play between these two, and Father MacPhail is very reluctant to allow anything he thinks might destabilize him. They receive what looks like a telegram during this meeting, letting them know about the soldiers who were attacked by the witches in the previous episode and have died. Father MacPhail very adeptly spins this and says that this is not actually a setback for the Magisterium, that this loss of these soldiers, who he refers to as martyrs, is actually a sign from the authority that there is trouble brewing. He says that the authority has sensed their lack of devotion within the Magisterium, and this is a punishment for that lack of devotion. He speaks to Father Graves directly and says that he can sense a stain of doubt on Father Graves. Doubt is an insult to the authority, he adds, and as a result, he has no choice but to send Father Graves to the cells. I loved how quickly this all happened and how masterfully. After quelling that potential mutiny and dismissing everyone, Father MacPhail actually asks Fra Pavel to stay and tells Fra Pavel that he needs to find out where Mrs. Coulter is, and Fra Pavel should consult the alethiometer. Now that Mrs. Coulter is dressed in her, let's call them normal clothing, she heads out of the bedroom and actually shuts the door on the golden monkey's face. She is planning on leaving without him because she knows just how conspicuous she would be in our world. This is kind of a shock, and I think it takes her a second to reconcile this within herself. The monkey is very, very distressed by this, but after collecting herself, Mrs. Coulter walks downstairs to present herself to Lord Boreal and, more importantly, ask for his car keys. He says that she looks incredible, no surprise there, but he also realizes that she does not have her demon with her. Mrs. Coulter gets very close to Lord Boreal and says surely she must not be the first woman he has met who's capable of self-control. And then she goes on to mention that the witches also have this ability, and she's sure that he has encountered them before. I thought this was so fascinating that she understands her very distinct, very unique, very dysfunctional relationship with her golden monkey demon as a manifestation of self-control. This was such an interesting layer to understanding how she is able to separate herself and also how she's able to be so disciplined at everything. Lord Boreal accepts this news with a surprising amount of calm and chill, and he says, okay, here are the keys. This is a really annoying and petty thing of me to say, but when did Mrs. Coulter learn how to drive? They don't really have cars like we do in her world, so I know that the Tesla has some self-driving powers, but this was kind of a loophole that I noticed immediately. As capable of leaving the golden monkey as Mrs. Coulter is, the golden monkey is not as capable at being separated. And there was such a sense of sadness. It was a real abandonment of him. And I couldn't help but wonder, we don't hear his voice, maybe because she never allows him to speak. He doesn't really have any agency. She has completely dominated him, and the golden monkey is a terrifying creature, but I honestly felt bad for him here. Mrs. Coulter is rifling through Dr. Malone's belongings when Dr. Malone herself walks in and finds her. She is very surprised, not excited about this visitor, and is super suspicious of Mrs. Coulter until Mrs. Coulter introduces herself as an experimental theologian and, more importantly, notes that she's also Lyra's mother. This seems to dispel any of the paranoia that Dr. Malone had. She invites Mrs. Coulter in and asks Mrs. Coulter about herself. She's not familiar with the idea of experimental theology and is definitely interested. Mary really gushes about Lyra to Mrs. Coulter and mentions how intelligent and special Lyra is. She talks specifically about Lyra's grasp of these particle physics. She mentions that Lyra is really great at reading the alethiometer, and I could see that Mrs. Coulter was very surprised to hear that. I got the idea that she did not know that Lyra could actually read the alethiometer, but just had it in her possession. And I kind of felt for Mrs. Coulter a little bit. She's realizing here that she has no idea who her daughter is. This perfect stranger has gotten to know her daughter better than she has. I think of Mrs. Coulter as a pretty classic narcissist. Narcissists don't believe that other people are capable, so to hear that not only is Lyra capable, but has this whole internal and external world that doesn't involve Mrs. Coulter at all must be a big shock. Lyra did not learn these things from Mrs. Coulter. She is everything she is, not because of Mrs. Coulter, and that is a pretty hard pill to swallow. In an attempt to be friendly and really get to know her, Dr. Malone asks Mrs. Coulter what her doctorate was in and whether she's published any papers that Mary might have come across. She's rummaging around making coffee at this point, and Mrs. Coulter looks extremely uncomfortable. And as soon as Mary turns around to get her French press, Mrs. Coulter leaves. This whole exchange must be very weird for Dr. Malone, and when she settles back into her office, she decides to Google Mrs. Coulter. She's in her room on her computer with the cave when the cave starts speaking to her of its own accord. It tells her that she is about to go on a journey, that she has been preparing for this her entire life, and she must play the serpent. The voice communicating to her tells her to find the horn beam and to deceive the guardian. It mentions that she'll be protected and that she must save the girl and the boy. It tells her that her work here is finished and that it won't speak to her again in this world. And then it shuts off. In Cittàgazze, Lyra and Will are walking around the city, still determined to figure out where they should best create their window to get the alethiometer back from Lord Boreal, and they end up running into Angelica, Paola, and Tullio, who we saw was attacked by specters at the end of the last episode. Angelica and Paola are completely beside themselves. They're kind of propping Tullio up, and he looks like hell. He looks basically like a Walking Dead person. When Angelica sees the two of them, she confronts Lyra and Will and tells them that this is completely their fault. Will and Lyra are genuinely sorry about this, and they both apologize, but Angelica is not having it, and she threatens them and says that they will get them. Will is very shaken up about this. He feels very guilty, and he says that it should have been Tullio with the knife. It shouldn't have been him. He never meant to hurt anyone. And Lyra and Pan both try to comfort him. Mary has left the lab and gone home to read the Bible. Why not? We see that she's reading a passage about the serpent, who is described as craftier than the other animals, when she receives a visit from her sister. She tells her sister that she is going to take some time off from work and go on a trip. When her sister asks her where she might be going, she says she's not sure, but she wants to go where life takes her. Mrs. Coulter returns to Lord Boreal's house and is met immediately by the golden monkey demon. There is no warm, hugging reunion between them. There's really just silence and sadness. She goes to Lord Boreal's collection room where he is and asks for a drink. She looks worn out. Lord Boreal asks Mrs. Coulter how she found Dr. Malone, and Mrs. Coulter describes Dr. Malone as impertinent, intelligent, and free. Lord Boreal says, "I found her arrogant, like so many women in this world." Oh, Lord Boreal, you scoundrel. Mrs. Coulter goes on to tell Lord Boreal that when she was an honorary scholar, she was the best in her class, and she wasn't actually able to get her doctorate because the Magisterium would not allow her to. She says that she had written many papers, but was never able to publish them unless she let a man take credit for them. This has obviously been weighing on Mrs. Coulter very heavily for all of these many years, and she is finally ready to unload. We get the impression that in meeting Dr. Malone, Mrs. Coulter realizes that Dr. Malone is the woman that she could have been if her circumstances had been different. If she had been born in this world, our world, she could have been a top scientist, passionate about her research, without having to manipulate the people around her. This life could have been about her intelligence, her ambition, and her skill, rather than about the limitations imposed upon her. And it really sparks kind of an existential crisis in her. In what feels like a particularly self-destructive move, Mrs. Coulter asks Lord Boreal what he remembers about her scandal with Lord Asriel. Lord Boreal says that he knows that Lord Asriel seduced her and then abandoned her. The way he talks about this incident is as if Mrs. Coulter had absolutely no agency and therefore no blame in the situation. He also says that he does not want to talk about Lord Asriel, and Mrs. Coulter says, "We're not talking about Asriel, we're talking about me." And there are tears in her eyes. She's really unwinding, and I think this is a crucial moment for her. Mrs. Coulter tells Boreal that she thinks that he's been wasting his time and his ability in this new world. He's been so busy collecting these trinkets, as she calls them, that he hasn't used any of the knowledge or information that this world offers back in their own native world. And for Mrs. Coulter, that's a real shame. Lord Boreal gets pretty defensive and says that it hasn't been about collecting trinkets and that he'd hoped that they could share this life together. She says, "My dear Carlo, if you actually got me, you wouldn't begin to know what to do with me." Mrs. Coulter does not want to be another possession in this collection. She is her own woman. She wants to stand on her own 2 feet, and she knows that Lord Boreal would never consider her his equal. Just when things are getting extremely tense between Lord Boreal and Mrs. Coulter, Lyra finally arrives at Lord Boreal's house as a distraction while Will plans on cutting in and getting the alethiometer and getting out. While Will is getting closer and closer to the alethiometer, which is sitting on that great couch, he is discovered by the golden monkey demon. Mrs. Coulter is kind of friendly towards him. She realizes who he is and tries to talk to him when Lyra bursts on the scene, hoping to get Will out of there, and is completely stunned when she sees that Mrs. Coulter is there as well. Mrs. Coulter offers the alethiometer to Lyra and says that she has heard that Lyra can read it. She would love if Lyra could show her a reading, and in exchange, Mrs. Coulter will tell her more about dust. At the same time, while Mrs. Coulter and Lyra are having this conversation, Lord Boreal is in the collection room as well, realizing that Will indeed has the knife, and he tells Will to give him the knife. Will is kind of freaking out, rightfully so. He says, Lyra, get the alethiometer, let's go right now. Lyra is completely caught up in this conversation with Mrs. Coulter though, and doesn't really pay much attention when Lord Boreal decides to rile up Will. He starts talking about Will's mother and says, think about her. I'd hate to see what could happen to someone so vulnerable. And they start fighting in earnest. It looks like Will might have the upper hand because he has the knife, but Lord Boreal is a fully grown man. He's very strong. He kind of overpowers Will. Mrs. Coulter hears Will calling to Lyra and tells Lyra that she must stay away from that boy. She says Lyra is so much like her. And this is really what sets Lyra off. She doesn't want to be anything like Mrs. Coulter, and in that moment, she does the same motion that we saw Mrs. Coulter do last season, and she sicks Pan on the golden monkey demon. Pan turns from being his cute normal self into a Wolverine like he was with the kids. Thank you, my YouTube friend who pointed out the Wolverine shape. Pan launches into the golden monkey and is trying to rip him into shreds, it looks like. Mrs. Coulter is, of course, immediately physically affected by this. Mrs. Coulter is in a lot of pain, but we see something change in her. She pulls herself together somehow, and she somehow masters this connection that she has with the golden monkey to be able to turn around to direct her attention to Lyra instead of the pain she's in, and she gets up. It was honestly chilling. It was so weird to see. And it also, to me, had such interesting implications about her mastery over the demon, over whatever it is her demon represents to her. She's able to separate him entirely. Will breaks a vase over Lord Boreal's head, sending him to the ground, and he's able to get the alethiometer, open a window, and call Lyra over. Lyra finally comes to her senses, realizes what a dire situation they're in, and she and Pan scoot through the window. Now that they're safe in their apartment in Cittàgazze, Will and Lyra have a chance to rest, relax, and discuss the craziness that just happened. Lyra joins Will, brings him coffee, and she sits down with Pan to talk about everything that has just unfolded. She thanks Will for helping her retrieve the alethiometer, and he kind of jokes and says like, oh, it was easy, and then looks at his 2 missing fingers. Will has really suffered a lot to get the alethiometer back, and it was kind of casually brushed over, but I definitely noticed it. Lyra talks about how much she does not want to be like her mom. She tells Will about the time that Mrs. Coulter used her demon to attack Pan to hurt her specifically. Lyra says that she is really hurt by Mrs. Coulter because she wants to trust her. Mrs. Coulter can seem so nice, but Lyra knows that she mustn't trust her, and that is very hard for her. She also says that doing something that Mrs. Coulter would do, acting like Mrs. Coulter, did not feel good, and that's not something she wants to repeat. I really appreciated this moment of self-awareness in Lyra. I think it is a sign of maturity to realize that you're bringing your toxic parent into a situation and it doesn't feel great. When Lyra's reflecting on how much she doesn't want to be like either of her parents, she says that she would like to be more like Ma Costa or Lee Scoresby. And we've seen that both of these adults have had really positive influences on Lyra. They've both treated her with so much love and respect. Will says that Lyra should just be Lyra though. She doesn't need to be like anyone else. Lyra promises Will that now that she has the alethiometer back, she's going to devote all of her energy to helping Will find his dad. Back in his collection room, Lord Boreal and Mrs. Coulter are pretty upset with each other. They seem to be just upset in general and are talking about what just happened. The honeymoon between these two is definitely over. I think they have both seen things in each other that they do not like. Mrs. Coulter is very sure that they need to pursue Lyra and Will to get these objects, and maybe more importantly, just to reunite with Lyra. Lord Boreal tells her that it is not possible to follow the kids into Cittàgazze and tells Mrs. Coulter about the specters of indifference. He tells her that they attack adults specifically and remove whatever it is that's human inside of us, And this really gives Mrs. Coulter an idea. When she hears that, she immediately makes the connection to dust, and she knows that she can master this. She knows that with her intelligence and her experience, she can do whatever the hell she wants with these specters. The episode ends with Dr. Malone wearing a backpack heading to that spot where we know the window that Lord Boreal has been using is. We can see that, just as the voice from the cave had mentioned, this place between the hornbeam trees is now guarded by someone, and there is a tent set up. Dr. Malone is able to deceive the guardian, and pretending to be Mrs. Coulter, she goes into the tent and into Chitagatse. We see her stick her hand through the window and then walk through to find herself in the city of magpies. So she is on her way. The journey has begun. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you are having a wonderful week. I look forward to more scenes with Lee Scoresby, with Joffrey, with the witches, with the Magisterium, with the whole gang next week. See you then.